Today I want to talk about the 1911 and its role in the 21st century. Now, I know a lot of people have an extreme opinion either that the 1911 is the best, pistol for combat, self-defense or whatever for 45 ACP, or people think it's complete junk because of the caliber or, all these little features, the size and weight, the capacity, the safety, the reliability, etc. There's a lot of opinions out there, right? So we're going to go over that, and I'm going to talk about, I guess it would have to be my opinion, but this is kind of just me taking a step back and looking at it. So first thing I want to touch on is the role that the 1911 plays and where it is today. Now, the military really isn't using it in any big numbers anymore. The Marine Corps, the MARSOC, is not really, but people don't see them as favoring it anymore. I believe they still do use it in a small capacity, but I believe it is going to be phased out. It may still be open for years or maybe a decade in MARSOC, knowing how the Marine Corps is. But, for the most part, the closest thing to combat it's probably seeing right now is with police units or the FBI. Their hostage rescue team uses it. But to my knowledge, from the research that I've done, they use it exactly the way I feel the 1911 is supposed to be used. And we'll get into that next, but for the most part, I see this as, I do think that it is a good combat pistol. It has actually proven itself to be a good combat pistol if it's properly maintained, as with anything. It is a very good carry pistol, granted that you're taking care of it, and some of the designs, like the really short barrels and stuff like that, they're kind of hard to optimize for the kind of abuse that you might put it under if you are to take it to a class where you're machine gunning rounds through it and trying to shoot fast with it and stuff like that. I don't think those designs were really optimized for that kind of usage, so that can be kind of tricky. But for the most part, I think that, like the pistol in front of you, a full-size 1911, this is very easy to make. A lot of companies are making them. Almost as many companies that are making 1911s. There's about as many companies that are making 1911s as there are companies that are making ARs. Probably not as many, but almost everybody's got a 1911 of their own. So it's a very popular design still today. They still do get sold. They do fly off the shelves, and you're seeing a lot more affordable options. Like the one in front of you is from Rock Island. This thing costs about $400. It has an ambidextrous safety, an adjustable trigger. It has a skeletonized hammer. A lot of awesome features, Novak sights and stuff like that. Magazine bumpers and stuff like that. Nice wood grips and stuff like that. So there's a lot of good features that you can get on 1911s without actually handing over an arm and a leg. And really, the statement "you get what you pay for" does not, from my experience, it does not actually apply anymore. But anyways, let's go ahead and talk about what I feel from my observation, my experience, and my training with the 1911, what I feel that the 1911 is really optimized for. Now, originally it was supposed to be a military service sidearm, but given its characteristics, its size, weight, capacity, and just the way that the human body is able to work with it, and just the features of it, having a manual safety and having a very touchy trigger, it's kind of like the AR, right? A souped up AR that has a 3-pound trigger and it needs a safety. Well, if you're going to have a trigger like this, you do need a safety as well, and I see it the same way. If you're going to criticize the manual safety on the 1911 with the trigger system that it has, I can understand criticizing a double action only pistol that has a manual safety or something like that, something ridiculous by today's standards. It's ridiculous by today's standards. But if you're going to criticize the 1911 that has a very sensitive trigger, then you also need to criticize your AR-15 for having a safety at all, because it's the same principle. You have a very sensitive trigger that's supposed to give you better accuracy. You can kind of lax out on your fundamentals on the trigger control. so that you can get a better shot, right? So the 1911, I feel, was designed to, I wouldn't say it's really designed, but it's basically a very good tool for, you don't need that many rounds. It's designed to be very slim, very ergonomic, and it's supposed to be whipped into action. It has a nice 5-inch barrel. It'll give you good ballistic performance, whether you get the 9mm variant or even the 45 ACP variant. You'll get very good ballistic performance. It has a long sight radius that kind of helps you a bit for very quick acquisition of your sights and stuff like that, and getting a good long range shot if you need it, or a very precise shot at least. And that nice light trigger, you're able to get off that shot very easily, and it's not a really hard pistol to use, and it's actually very quick to reload if you know what you're doing. So I feel like this is one of the fastest guns that you can have if you want to have a combat pistol. A lot of people say, well, there's an extra step because you have a safety. Well, yeah, there's an extra step for your AR or your rifle because it has a safety too. What do? As you're going up, you're taking off the safety, right? As you're coming down, you put the safety back on. Same thing with the 1911. Nothing changes, just your mindset does. So let's go ahead and move on, and let's talk about some of the individual points that people criticize. First thing I want to talk about is size, weight, and capacity of the 1911. Now, the 1911, it weighs about 2 pounds. There's no getting around that. Typically, it's going to weigh about 2 pounds, maybe 1.5 pounds if they lighten up things, put polymers in there, whatever. I never really noticed the weight myself. I never really cared. I carried heavy things a lot when I was in the military, and I'm just not a wuss to weight. And I wear a belt, and I just carry things. I mean, if a 2-pound gun is heavy, then I don't understand how you can carry a wallet, keys, or really anything else. I don't understand why people get all up in arms about a little bit of weight. It doesn't really weigh that much on you. If you get a holster, it's not about getting a good quality holster. Of course, if it's loose in your pocket, you're going to notice it. But if you get a holster, then it's not really going to be that big of a deal. I had basically the next best thing from a used gym stock, an Uncle Mike's holster, one of those little fabric ones, one of those really cheap ones, and that's what I stuck my 1911 in when I was getting started, and I was waiting for money to come around so I could get a better holster. Something that would hold it in real secure, like a Kydex holster or whatever, when I was having one made. So weight does not mean anything to me. You had a bunch of draftees and kids that carried these things into combat and never complained about it. So when you complain about the weight of the 1911, say it's too heavy to carry, it's too heavy to do this or that, you'll just die, walking around with it, then please don't be the one to complain about this generation needing safe spaces and how they're so weak and stuff like that, because you're now looking weak, complaining about the weight of something that nobody else in history really complained about. They just wanted something that would work and defend their life, and that is exactly what this pistol does. Now, let's go ahead and move on to size. I understand that the size of this pistol is big. It is big. I carried it a lot. It's about 5.5 inches tall, and I would typically carry it with flush 8-round magazines in. It basically is the same height as your M&Ps, your Glock 17s or whatever, but it's a single stack. It's pretty slim. I never really had a problem carrying this and concealing it being the biggest thing. The 1911 typically has about an 8-round capacity these days. It's very unusual to find a 7-round capacity, and usually you'll want to upgrade to 8-rounders, and typically that's what you can get flush. A lot of times you'll get little bumpers on the magazines, and I think that is complete crap. I think you should get a flush 8-rounder, and then you can get a bumper with it, because I see it as the same principle as any other pistol. I want a flush magazine, because if I want to carry it, I want as much of that height taken off as possible. So, with that, I feel that the capacity 8+1 is just fine. I feel like it's just fine. A lot of people say that they're not comfortable with it, that it's lacking in capacity. It's a single stack gun. It's slim. It's not like as thick as a Glock or a Glock 17 or a Glock 21 and still having 8 rounds. That's just ridiculous. It doesn't make sense to argue that. So basically, that's the same as arguing that the Car CM9 only has 6+1 rounds instead of like, I don't know, 10+1 or 12+1, because hey, the M&P compact or the F&S compact or the Glock 26 has more capacity. Well, that's because the Glock 26 or whatever, it's a wider gun, it's a double stack. So you're giving up that width, that thin profile for more rounds. The 1911 is not doing that. So that argument is invalid. It's a completely different purpose, completely different design. They do make double stack 1911s and they carry 14 rounds. So if you want to go that route, then go that route. But other than that, you don't really have room to complain because it doesn't make sense to complain about it. That's like getting upset at a motorcycle because you can't carry 5 people on it. You know, it just doesn't make sense. It's not a car. You can't carry 5 people and have a full trunk. So, to me, it's the same thing as complaining about that. Next thing I want to talk about is the safety. Now, a lot of people like to criticize the safety on the 1911 because it exists. And they say, well, I don't like manual safeties because it's another step. There's no reason for it. You got a pretty sensitive trigger there, brosif. You got a very sensitive trigger on the 1911. And it's for good reason, whether it was part of the design and, you know, it's supposed to be very sensitive or not. It is a pretty sensitive trigger. It is not like today where it's basically a lever that you smush. It is a straight pull, very well integrated, and that thing goes off like nothing in comparison to a lot of pistols today. That may be a 5-pound trigger, but that thing's going to feel like a 2-pound trigger. So, here's the thing. A lot of people, you like your ARs, right? You like your triggers on your ARs to be quote-unquote good. Now, your definition of good is a little different from mine, but your definition of good typically means like a trigger that basically almost goes off just by touching it. Well, you have a safety on the AR, right? And you need to have it on. You need to have the safety on when you're not firing it, right? You know, just precaution, keeping your finger off the trigger, etc. Well, what do you do when your safety's on and you're going to engage a target? You flip it off, right? Well, that's the same principle with the 1911. It's got a very sensitive trigger, very touchy trigger for very quick engagements, maybe even at long range. You can make very precise shots with a 1911, and that's because of the trigger. The trigger basically allows you to, it's very forgiving of poor trigger control in that sense. If you get a really light trigger, you basically, once you touch it, it wants to go off. So, you know, same thing with the AR. Everybody likes their light triggers because they're sloppy on trigger control or whatever, and it shows when you go to different platforms with heavier triggers. See it all the time. And that's just the way it is. I mean, it's the same for me. But, you know, it's the same principle as your AR. When you go up on the target from, you know, whatever your ready position or whatever, you sweep off the safety and you're ready to fire. Same thing with the 1911. When you're off target, when there's no more targets, that safety goes back on, right? Finger off the trigger, safety on. Same principle. Nothing changes. Only your mindset and your attitude. So, next thing I want to talk about is reliability. Now, the 1911 has been serving for over a century reliably. And a lot of people think that the 1911 is unreliable if it gets dirty and needs to be lubricated a bunch, blah, blah, blah. It is about as unreliable as your AR-15 is. It is the same as the AR-15. The 1911 and the AR-15 are America's baby. So, here's the thing. The AR does not need to be drowned in lubricant. Neither does the 1911. The AR is not inherently unreliable. Neither is the 1911. And here's the thing. Parts do need to be maintained on the AR just as they do on the 1911. If you try to shorten the mechanism or you're just not making your parts properly, you will have problems with your AR, just as you will with your 1911, okay? So with the 1911, when you get a very short barrel, like a 3-inch barrel, and then you're trying to machine gun that sucker, and you don't do regular spring changes, you're not keeping track of your spring tensions, it is very hard to get a spring that'll be able to take that kind of pressure. And just making those kinds of springs, making springs in general, is a tricky task, really, because springs break all the time. They either last forever, or they last about the time that they should last per their design, or they just break immediately. And you've seen it on my channel all the time. Springs break. The CCP07 spring broke early. I've had a lot of springs break early. I've had a lot of parts break early. And that's just part of it. You just got to watch after your stuff, look for warning signs, stuff like that. It happens. But when you're shortening a gun to basically push the level of its acceptable performance, you're going to challenge the platform inherently. And I get it. You're going to be running the risk of kind of stretching the reliable function of the firearm to the point where it's going to start becoming unreliable. It's going to start tearing itself apart. So you got to be careful when you're doing that, and you see that with Kimber. They got to hook up double recoil springs. They got to basically remake the 1911 slide and frame and the springs and stuff like that to make it to where this thing is not going to tear itself apart every time you shoot it. But therein, when you're shooting guns like that, there are sacrifices that you are going to make. You may have to maintain it more. You may have to lubricate it more. It may just be such a small package, it may generate so much heat, it might burn off the lubricant you're using. Or it may foul up a lot more because there's a lot less fully burnt powder that gets expelled back, so you probably get more fouling back into the action. So it may need to be lubricated more, or the fitting might need to be more loose if it's going to be a little more reliable. Just little details here and there. So the reliability is very dependent on the construction and stuff like that, and there's a lot of variables to it. But in general, I've never seen a 1911 that was just inherently unreliable. For the most part, the saying of "you get what you pay for" is complete bogus in the 1911 world. A lot of times people will make excuses like break-in periods and stuff for $1,000 1911s made by Kimber or Springfield or whatever, and then when this pistol right here has one issue with an extractor that's really tight, or a recoil spring that's really tight, and you have one malfunction after 50 rounds of the first 50 rounds that you've ever put through the 1911, and it never gives you a malfunction ever again. They call that unreliable. That is where I run into problems with people, because you cannot claim that your $2,000 1911 is more reliable than mine when you've had all these malfunctions, or you may had no malfunctions. That was my experience. I had no malfunctions with all my full-size 1911s, and then I got down to a 3.5-inch 1911, and I started having a lot of weird things happen. But that's something for another video. But in all, I feel that the 1911 is still very relevant today. I do not see it as a big issue. Most of the methods in which you run your guns today, and most of the gun designs today, are following the influence that the 1911 has provided. This pistol has been used successfully throughout the world by us, and maybe by some others in other countries. But for the most part, most of the things that we know as far as what we need to do in order to run a gun faster and much better and shoot a gun better was learned on the 1911 the hard way. So don't sit there and bash a firearm that somehow is just still very relevant today. The design still lives on. So for me, the 1911 is still a good pistol. Do I use it regularly? No, not really. I use other pistols because I choose to. I don't have to stick with it. But in general, it's not the best, not the worst. It's actually a pretty proven design. I like it. but I don't see somebody using it as being a bad idea. If they use it, as long as they're competent with it, then I think that they're going to go far. If you learn the basics of the pistol, you can actually start running it very fast. It is a very rewarding pistol for any shooter, being very slim, very ergonomic, very natural. And once you learn how to make it a habit of switching on and off the manual safety at the right times, just like your AR, this thing is it's gonna flow. Running this gun is gonna become a breeze if you practice enough. So, with all that said, I'll go ahead and quit talking, but thanks a lot for watching. You guys have a good one, and remember, keep an open mind and, keep shooting.